Good morning. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. It is a joy to see each one of you this morning. It's a gorgeous Sunday morning here in Salt Lake, and it's a great day to be at church. If you're visiting with us, you are our honored guests, and we are so glad that you're here. I invite you to stop by the welcome table just outside this door in our fellowship hall after worship. Let us introduce ourselves to you and get to know you better as well. For 129 years, this church has stood for big hearts to love and strong hearts to fight, as our choir sang about just a moment ago. This church has been a place of religious diversity of thought and expression, and where love guides us to a better world. This morning, as every Sunday when we gather, we light the flaming chalice, the symbol of our faith. And today we light it with these words from our Unitarian ancestor, the Reverend Theodore Parker. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I can see, I am sure it bends toward justice. I invite you now to rise in body or in spirit. We're not singing 123. Sorry, Spirit of Life fans. We're singing 160, 160. It's always a good Sunday morning when we have our choir with us. I love choir Sundays. It's such a joy to sing in a choir, to dig into a work of art with other people, and know that no one has to carry it alone. We're all going to carry it together. Singing in a choir is a wonderful exercise in community building. The topic of our worship today is a difficult one in which the threat that looms on the horizons of the headlines actually comes into view over the next ridge. Some of us have the resources and the capacity of heart to face a challenge like this head-on. And some of us have grief enough in our own lives. There's simply not room to hold the grief of the world, too. But one of the loveliest things about singing in a choir is that when the music calls for the singers to hold out a sustained note or phrase, the individual choir members do what's called staggered breathing. That is, they take turns breathing quietly while everyone else is holding the note. That way, the note seems to go on without a break, and no one passes out from lack of oxygen. It's just one of those tricks that musicians use to make the magic happen. So if you are traveling through a season of acute grief or suffering today, if you're traveling through a liminal space and you're not able to engage this topic deeply, I want you to know that it's okay. The rest of us will be your choir mates, holding the note while you take a deep, sustaining breath of community. Let's breathe together silently for a moment now, feeling what it feels like not to be alone, to be held up by one another. You are not alone here in this community. Opening our hearts to one another and to ourselves, we find that we make beautiful music together. May it be so. Our reading this morning comes from a book called Migrating to Prison by Cesar Cuauhtemoc Garcia Hernandez. Despite the common refrain that immigration law is broken, immigration imprisonment is a sign that the United States immigration policy is working exactly as designed. The system hasn't malfunctioned. It was intended to punish, stigmatize, and marginalize, all for political and financial gain. Politicians get elected, local governments receive revenue, corporations profit, and white racists find comfort against the prevailing winds of change that bring different languages, different people, and new challenges to old communities. That is exactly what's happening. We can think of immigration prisons as a jobs program. For economically struggling regions where good-paying, steady jobs are hard to come by, immigration prisons are the 21st century version of the Depression-era Works Progress Administration. Through the WPA, scores of workers laid the wires that lit up the Tennessee Valley, dressed up post offices with glorious murals, and recorded the memories of former slaves. Immigration prisons also provide jobs in out-of-the-way places. Only instead of bridges, timeless works of art, and priceless oral histories, we have the trauma of imprisonment to show for it. The consequences are different, but to mayors and city councilors, it is someone else's money for their gain. With eye-catching dollar amounts moving from Washington to small towns, it is no surprise that elected officials fight to keep federally financed prisoners in their communities, instead of trying to find other job prospects for their constituents. Elected officials come to depend on the federal government's largesse and often show no interest in changing course. But for all their costs, immigration prisons often fail to deliver the benefits they promise. Private prison companies claim to be agnostic about laws expanding imprisonment, but this is a tough claim to swallow given how much they reap from immigration prisons. Roughly 2/3 of ICE detainees are held in private facilities, with an average daily population of 38,000 in fiscal year 2017, and at an average cost of $129 per day for each person. The private prison industry as a whole gets $3.2 million from ICE alone every single day. Private prison corporations do their part to limit second-guessing by regularly contributing to candidates and elected officials. From 2017 to 2018, the 3 largest private prison corporations operating in the United States, including Core Civic, send over $800,000 to candidates' campaigns and spent $3.5 million on lobbying. Seeing only the harsh edge of an immigration policy that has grown ever harsher under President Trump can turn even the most reasonable observer into a cynic. I prefer to search for hope, to think of the Trump moment as an opportunity to revisit assumptions. And no assumption is harder to uproot than the hold that immigration prisons have on people who make immigration policy and those who contest it. Without escaping the immigration prison's walls, it might be impossible to escape the prison system's racism and mass commodification of human life. Thank you, friends, for holding this space with us this morning, diving into this difficult topic and staying awake and aware. At this time, I have just a few announcements for our community. First off, during coffee hour today, there's an opportunity to learn more about the Church Endowment Fund and the Emerson Legacy Society. It's a chance to think about how we might make this church last another 129 years in this valley, or maybe even more. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Committee members are holding a brief session to explain ways that people can memorialize a loved one, leave a legacy, and support the work of this church in the future. So we invite anyone who is interested in doing so to bring your coffee and just meet, I think, Mark Mullen. Is Mark here today?
I'm up here.
Oh, he's up there. Okay. Look for Mark Mullen on the south end of the fellowship hall, kind of near the TV. That's where you'll find Mark, and he'd love to talk to you about this. Next week, I know a lot of you will be out of town. I hope that you can come back for Sunday morning, because it's going to be a special worship service. As many of you know, our senior minister, Tom Goldsmith, will be retiring at the end of next year after what will be 34 years in ministry here in Salt Lake City. So next week on Sunday, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit from the pulpit about what is this process of ministerial transition that we'll be undergoing. It's a long process. It won't be that long of a sermon, though. So please come on Sunday. If you're not able to be here, I will be live on Facebook, and then we'll, of course, have it on YouTube by Wednesday. And finally, as the world swirls around outside, we also care for our community here inside these walls. And I'm sad to announce, if you haven't already heard, that our dear friend Eddie Ellison died this week on Thursday. She was in her 90s. She was not in pain when she died. She died peacefully, and we will all be blessed by her memory. I'd like to extinguish our chalice just for a moment as we remember her. For all that is our life, we sing our thanks and praise. For all life is a gift which we are called to use to build the common good and make our own days glad. At this time, we accept the offerings of the community to support the work of our church here in Salt Lake City. We also take this opportunity to greet one another in friendship and welcome our visitors as well. And we are live on Facebook this morning. Did you know? Just the sermon, and it's just me. It's not getting your faces, so don't worry about it. But we hear that it's helpful for people who are traveling or who can't be with us, maybe who are sick. And so, we've been giving it a try this year, and it seems to be working out pretty well so far. It's just my page, though. So, send me a friend request. You can watch the sermon. If you don't like Facebook, it's okay. It'll be on YouTube on Wednesday. So, friends, I want you to know that I am a person of optimism and joy. Things are never as bad as they seem, and there's always something to be grateful for. My Unitarian Universalist faith lifts me up and gives me courage, and I hope it's the same for you. But I'm getting tired of getting up in this pulpit and preaching about how to survive these times. Are you tired of hearing it yet? I would love to be preaching to you about how to foster interreligious dialogue, or the practice of covenant, or Louisa May Alcott's wonderfully wacky Unitarian father, or any number of other wonderful things that cross my mind and yours throughout the week. Things that would nourish us and make us better people and better Unitarian Universalists. Instead, Reverend Tom and I have to get up in this pulpit every week and try to say something that will lift your heads up for another week of resisting the creep of fascism. And by the way, we have to say something that will lift us up for another week too, because every day is a new assault on our faith and our values. And I think that the biggest challenge that we are facing in these times is learning to balance staying awake and engaged with protecting ourselves and our tender hearts from becoming fearful and bitter, unable to enjoy this wonderful, glorious life that we've been given. It's easy to feel overwhelmed just turning on the news in the morning. There's a feeling of dread, like, what now? Each one of us wants to do something. But when everything is on fire all at once, where do we start? We want to do something that feels meaningful and effective, something that makes a difference. But both our attention and our effort are divided so many ways. And being pulled in too many directions is the fastest way to burn out, especially if you yourself are at risk from the cruel policies of this government. Out of all the indignities and travesties slung across our headlines this week, there are two that I just really can't let go of. The first, President Trump at the National Prayer Breakfast slamming Mitt Romney for acting on his conscience, for using his faith as justification for his vote to remove the president from office. Well, are we Americans going to act on our conscience or not? If faith can't be a justification for making an unpopular decision, then I don't know what can. But the other news story that really won't let me go was the one in which prosecutor Ken Starr borrowed the words with which we lit our chalice this morning to defend the impeached president. They are famous words, often attributed to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who also borrowed them from our Unitarian ancestor, Reverend Parker. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice. Theodore Parker actually knew a lot about the moral universe. Parker lived in times just as fraught with danger as those we live in today. He kicked off his ministry in fine fashion by presenting a now famous sermon in which he broke down just about every tenet of 19th century Christian dogma. Made a lot of friends that way. So many that he had to go to Europe for a few years until the storm he kicked up died down. He returned in 1844 to a country that was, if you can imagine it, even more deeply divided than the one we live in today, though not by much. 6 years later, Parker found himself leading the charge of people of faith against the Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1850 and requiring law enforcement and ordinary people to assist in the return of escaped enslaved people to their so-called owners. In response to this grossly immoral law, Parker and his followers formed the Boston Vigilance Committee, which refused to cooperate with the act and essentially turned Boston into what we might think of today as a sanctuary city. Their resistance was so effective that in the time between the committee's formation until the dawn of the Civil War 11 years later, only 2 fugitives were returned from the Boston area, and both instances were met with mass protests. Now, would the Boston Vigilance Committee have had this kind of success had Parker not been the pastor of a congregation that numbered over 2,000 parishioners? Hard to say. And what sort of effort must have been necessary to keep them going for 11 years in the face of immense racial violence and the darkening clouds of civil war? I don't know for sure. But I think that Parker's famous words about the length and curve of the moral arc of the universe lead me to believe that he and his followers were playing a much longer game than 11 years. They were playing for the future of our country, a country that they left to all of us, their descendants. From slavery to westward expansion to Japanese internment to today, when nearly 500,000 human beings spend time in immigration detention facilities across the country annually, it seems there has never been a time in our country's history when our government didn't give us a target population for hate, mistrust, and exploitation. Our congregation knows about this very well. For the past 2 years, you have given your hearts, your time, your money, and your prayers to Vicky Chavez and her family, who have lived here in our church building as they await the outcome of their legal claim to asylum. And through this experience, you have learned what life is like for undocumented people in this country. Many of you now know how the undocumented have to live in the shadows, watching over their shoulders as they go to work or run errands every day. You know them to be good people on the whole, good neighbors who contribute richly to our common life and common good here in this valley and across the country. You know that many of them are refugees from countries torn apart by war, drugs, and violence, often countries in whose violence the U.S. has direct culpability for which it has never answered. And you know that the so-called crime of living in the country without documentation is often a mere misdemeanor, the equivalent of a broken taillight. Sometimes, as is often the case with asylum seekers, there's actually no crime at all. But because of the cruelty and racism of our national immigration laws, many of these people are one broken taillight or one missed court date away from being thrown into detention, just as if they had committed a horrible crime. Ironically, the framers of the Constitution didn't bother to say much about immigration in the earliest days of our republic. It wasn't until 1891 that anyone cared enough to make a law about it. That was just after the days when the Transcontinental Railroad had been laid, and the white folks settling the West Coast turned their ire on the Chinese immigrants who had built it. That was the year that the first immigration detention facility was put into use, a California shipyard building that was technically neither inside nor outside the United States. And today, immigrants who are detained by the government are being held without due process because they're not citizens, held without charges other than the authorities haven't decided where they belong. Immigration law in the U.S. is notoriously Byzantine and expensive, and non-citizens aren't entitled to legal representation. Even the slightest misstep grants Immigration and Customs Enforcement authority to arrest them, and often in front of their coworkers or families, and ship them to detention facilities for an unknown stay, weeks, months, years. They're under no obligation to let their families know where they are, or when, or whether they'll return. This is the country that we live in today. Let me bring it even closer to home. Our neighbors right here in Salt Lake City who are being detained by ICE are currently taken to a facility either in Aurora, Colorado or Henderson, Nevada, 6 to 8 hours away. But that could change soon, as the Department of Homeland Security is paving the way for a new facility to be built a mere hour and a half away, just over the state line in Evanston, Wyoming. The contractor for this facility is CoreCivic, a private prison company formerly known as Corrections Corporation of America. CoreCivic claims to be in the government solutions business. And Evanston's leaders are enthusiastic about the possibility of attracting them to town. Like many rural communities, Evanston is not winning big from the great economy we keep hearing about. They need jobs. And friends, it's not something to sniff at. The need for sustainable employment in rural places is real and serious. But too many of these communities have turned in their desperation to the private prison industry to save them. The last time that Wyoming turned to immigrant detention for economic sustainability was in 1942, when the government began construction of the Heart Mountain Relocation Center, a forced relocation camp for Japanese immigrants. 2,000 workers helped build the camp north of Cody over approximately 60 days, and Wyoming's unemployment rate was turned around within a matter of weeks. But whatever economic benefits may come to Wyoming can't make up for the downsides. Detention supervision in this industry causes moral injury, as guards and administrators are forced to participate in family separation, child detention, and cruel punishment. According to Detention Watch, a national coalition to end immigrant detention, 195 immigrants have died in private detention in the U.S. since 2003. These are not jobs that make a community stronger or healthier. But it's a quick fix for politicians who would love to claim that they're making the country safer while stocking the tax coffers. So what does a detention facility in Wyoming have to do with us? The proposal for the new facility has been expanded since its original inception to have space for around 1,000 beds. And in a for-profit facility, beds that aren't full are losing money. So ICE raids would increase, more people would be detained, most of them not from Wyoming, but from the Salt Lake area. So this isn't a somewhere else problem. We're talking about our neighbors, our coworkers, our friends and community members. Now, I don't want to live in a community where we turn our backs on our neighbors, no matter where they come from, how they worship, whom they love, or how they got here. I want to live in a community where we all take care of each other and look out for each other, and where we resist the forces of evil in the halls of power. I don't want to close my eyes and pretend like nothing is happening when I know that it is. The Unitarian minister and theologian James Luther Adams had this to say about it during the time when fascism was creeping across Europe and another kind of outcast people were being rounded up. We of the middle class are tempted, indeed almost fated, to adopt the religion of the successful. This religion of the successful amounts to a systematic concealment of and separation from reality, a hiding of the plight of those who in one sense or another live across the tracks. In this end, this concealment comes from a failure to identify and enter into combat with what St. Paul called the principalities and powers of evil. The religion of the successful turns out then to be a sham spirituality, a cultivated blindness, for it tends to reduce itself to personal kindliness and philanthropy, costing little. Thus, it betrays the world with a kiss. Personal kindliness and philanthropy costing little. That's not good enough for me, and I don't think it is for you either. We are people of faith, and we know now more than ever that our values are going to cost us something, especially in these times. We are called to a greater faith and a greater love than that. Now, our community here at First Church does not have 2,000 parishioners like Reverend Parker's church, at least not yet, but I know that there are many more than 2,000 people of goodwill and faith here in the Salt Lake Valley. People who love their neighbors, even the ones we don't know and may never see or meet. People who are willing to fight to overcome the principalities and powers of evil, as Dr. Adams said, who will keep their courage up until they prevail. People with the wisdom and energy to play a long game. I want our friends in Evanston to know that they're not fighting this battle alone, that we are with them. That's why I've asked my colleagues at our neighboring faith communities in this region to speak to their congregations about this issue sometime in the month of February. And I'm asking you to speak to your neighbors and friends, to your coworkers and family members. Tell them that this isn't right and that they need to know what's happening, even if the government doesn't want them to know or care. Let your local representatives know that you're aware of the plans to build a prison in Wyoming for the purpose of separating Utah families, and ask them to denounce it publicly. Support legislation that would ban private detention here in Utah and anywhere in the U.S. And ask your human resource manager to make sure that your company's retirement plan doesn't invest in the private prison industry, because it is always wrong to profit from other people's misery. It is always wrong to profit from other people's misery. If Utahns mean to be a family-friendly people, then we have to say no to policies and projects that will separate families. It's time that we formed a Utah Vigilance Committee, a Wyoming Vigilance Committee, a Mountain West Vigilance Committee, and in the spirit of Reverend Theodore Parker, take a stand against those who would take away our neighbors. This is a place where we can banish the despair of not knowing what to do or how to be effective. We can fix this one. The author from whose book I read earlier, Garcia Hernandez, reminds us that this is so. He writes in his conclusion, "If nightmares can become reality, why can't dreams?" Instead of the immigration law enforcement strategy afraid of migrants pouring into our churches and schools, onto our streets and playgrounds, I imagine a different future. I imagine a future that looks more like United States history than United States present. I imagine a future in which immigration prisons do not exist. But countering the dehumanizing spirit of the bipartisan embrace of immigration prisons needs to begin with a wholesale embrace of the imperfect humanity of migrants. Migrants are superheroes, and they're also imperfect. And they aren't imperfect because they aren't citizens. Migrants are imperfect because they are people, just people. Any political alliance with migrants requires embracing all of this. Garcia Hernandez closes his book with a wonderful quote from the philosopher Slavoj Žižek. "The point is not to recognize ourselves in strangers, not to gloat in the comforting falsity that they are like us, but to recognize a stranger in ourselves. What we have in common with migrants to this country is that we are all imperfect people. We all make mistakes. but we all want a better future for ourselves and our families. That's a dream that's worth fighting for. Let us close our worship, rising in body or in spirit, and singing once more the song that the choir sang for us before the break, Quando al Pobre. We will sing the English lyrics, which are printed in your order of service. Please rise. Our closing words are by L.R. Nost. Do not be dismayed by the brokenness of the world. All things break, and all things can be mended. Not with time, as they say, but with intention. So go, love intentionally, extravagantly, unconditionally. The broken world waits in darkness for the light that is you. Amen. David. Beautiful music. Thank you, choir, especially those of you who stayed for a second service to help us out with that last hymn. That's really cool. Thank you. Friends, on February 29th, that's Leap Day, so it's easy to remember, there's going to be a public hearing about this issue, and we're inviting people from all over Salt Lake to attend, and we want you to come as well. When I have the time and the location, I will let you know. In the meantime, wyosayno.com. Wyoming, right? Wyosayno is where you can learn more about what's happening in Evanston and help us stop it. For now, please enjoy some coffee, each other's conversation, and do find out about the endowment committee. Thank you.